A woman begged a mob boss to kill her ex-boyfriend. Then he does something that changes her life forever. Watch until the end. Comment what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10. I really want to know if you liked my story, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The early hours of a December night in New York City cut through the skin like a cold blade, and the shadowy alleys of Hell's Kitchen seemed to whisper secrets that only men like Adrian Vance knew how to decipher. At 40, he walked toward a matte black Lamborghini Huracan with the confidence of someone who knew every shadow, every corner, every possible threat on those streets. 4 armed bodyguards formed a discreet perimeter around him, their trained eyes constantly scanning the environment for any suspicious movement. Adrian had just closed a deal that would move $50 million in the next 6 months. High-purity Colombian cocaine would make its way through the port of Miami, disguised in coffee shipments that, ironically, would carry a Brazilian aroma to the rest of the world. The irony wasn't lost on him. The son of an Irish immigrant who had built a fortune through questionable means, Adrian inherited not only the family empire, but also the coldness necessary to command it with an iron fist. The tattoos that decorated his arms told the story of decades in the underworld. Eastern dragons intertwined with symbols of the Italian and Russian mafias snaked up his tanned skin, while an eagle with outstretched wings dominated his broad back. Each design represented an alliance, a conquered territory, a battle won. His penthouse overlooking Central Park was a sanctuary of luxury and paranoia, protected by military-grade security systems and inhabited by a revolving door of different women each week. Empty relationships that fed his reputation as a ruthless conqueror, but could never touch a soul hardened by years of necessary violence and betrayal. It was then that she emerged from the shadows like an apparition that defied all the logic of that brutal world. Chloe Evans staggered under the faint light of the street lamps, her angelic face stained with fresh blood that trickled from a cut on her forehead. Her disheveled blonde hair framed delicate features that contrasted violently with the desperation shining in her blue eyes. There was something about her that made Adrian stop in the middle of the alley, a survival instinct honed by decades, telling him that this young woman represented a kind of danger he had never faced before. Chloe was only 21, but she carried on her shoulders the weight of a lifetime of struggle. The daughter of a cleaning lady, raised in a rough neighborhood in the outer boroughs, she had defied all odds to get a scholarship to study business at NYU. She worked part-time at a luxury boutique on Madison Avenue, where she served women who spent on a single item what her mother earned in 6 months. The job was a daily humiliation disguised as an opportunity, but Chloe swallowed her pride because every dollar saved brought her closer to pulling her mother, Sarah Evans, out of poverty. It was at the boutique that she met Ethan Cole, a young real estate mogul who initially charmed her with promises of love and stability. Tall, dark-haired, always impeccably dressed, he represented everything she had never dared to dream of for herself. The first few months were an urban fairy tale. Dinners at expensive restaurants, trips to exclusive resorts, gifts that cost more than her salary. Ethan made her feel special, chosen, as if her humble origins were just an irrelevant detail in the face of the love he swore he felt. The nightmare began slowly, as it always does with men like Ethan. First came the subtle comments about her clothes, her friends, her dreams. Then came the insistent questions about where she was, who she was talking to, why she took so long to answer his texts. Tracking apps appeared on her phone, disguised as romantic gifts. He wanted to know every step she took, every breath she took. The isolation was gradual but effective. First, he pushed her away from her college friends, then her co-workers, until Chloe found herself completely dependent on his approval and presence. The first physical assault happened one night in August, after she questioned why he had cancelled plans to introduce her to his parents. A slap, he claimed, was an accident, an apology accompanied by expensive flowers and promises that it would never happen again. But it happened again and again, until Chloe lost count of how many times she woke up with marks on her body that she had to hide under makeup and long sleeves. The discovery of the other women was the final blow. Ethan maintained at least 3 parallel relationships, always with vulnerable young women he manipulated with the same cruel expertise he used to dominate real estate deals. When Chloe finally found the courage to end things 3 weeks ago, he simply didn't accept it. A breakup was not an option in his controlling world. She was his property, an investment he wasn't willing to lose. What followed was a systematic campaign of stalking that made Chloe question her own sanity. Ethan would show up at her job, at the university, at her mother's house. He sent threatening messages in the middle of the night, hired private investigators to watch her, and spread lies about her to anyone who would listen. The police listened to her complaints, with the skepticism reserved for domestic violence cases. After all, he never left concrete evidence, always maintaining the facade of a respectable businessman. The night before, Ethan had escalated his obsession to an unprecedented level of violence. He broke into the small apartment Chloe shared with her diabetic mother in Queens, beat her with a clinical coldness that terrified her more than the blows themselves, and made a threat that still echoed in her ears as she staggered through that dark alley. If she didn't come back to him in 48 hours, he would kill Sarah Evans slowly, making sure Chloe watched every second of her mother's suffering. That's how she ended up there. Clutching an envelope with $2,000, the entire desperate savings of a family that had never had anything left over. Through whispered conversations among high society clients at the boutique, Chloe had discovered that Adrian Vance was known in the darkest circles as someone who could solve problems permanently. It didn't matter the price. It didn't matter the consequences. She needed Ethan to disappear from her life forever. When her blue eyes met his in that dimly lit alley, something happened that neither of them could comprehend. Adrian, who had never hesitated to eliminate enemies or traitors, who had built his reputation on a total lack of mercy, was completely paralyzed by this injured young woman who trembled with cold and fear, yet still met his gaze without looking away. "I need you to kill someone for me," Chloe said in a hoarse voice that tried to hide her desperation. "I have the money here." Adrian looked at the crumpled envelope, then at her bruised face, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt something he had learned to bury under layers of cynicism and brutality. It wasn't pity. Men like him couldn't afford that feeling. It was something deeper, more unsettling. It was the recognition of a courage he himself had lost long ago, the distant memory of what it felt like to be desperate enough to risk everything for someone you loved. "Who?" he asked, surprised by his own question. He normally didn't get personally involved in the details. He had men for that. "Ethan Cole, a businessman, lives in a brownstone in Greenwich Village. He's going to kill my mother if I don't." Chloe's voice broke, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "If I don't go back to him." The name was not unknown to Adrian. Ethan Cole had interesting political connections, laundered money through shell real estate companies, and had unsuccessfully tried to establish business with smaller underworld organizations. He was the kind of man Adrian despised, cowardly enough to hit women, smart enough to never get his own hands dirty with real work. But when Adrian opened his mouth to accept the job, the words just wouldn't come out. There was something in those blue eyes, bathed in unshed tears, in the way Chloe stood tall despite her injuries, in the desperate dignity with which she offered her family's entire wealth for protection, that touched a part of him he thought was long dead. "Keep your money," he said finally, pushing the envelope back into her hands more gruffly than he intended. This isn't the kind of problem you solve with death. The confusion on Chloe's face mirrored what he himself was feeling. Adrian Vance had just refused a simple job, an easy payment, to protect a young woman he didn't even know. And the most disturbing part of it all was that he couldn't explain why, not even to himself. Adrian's bodyguards exchanged perplexed looks when he ordered them to take Chloe to Mount Sinai Hospital, the best in the city. It was the first time in 15 years of work that they had seen the boss show any kind of concern for a wounded stranger. Marco, the most senior of the group, whispered something in Leo's ear about making sure the girl wasn't armed or on some kind of drug that could affect the boss's judgment. Chloe protested the entire way to the hospital. She had no health insurance, couldn't afford a private visit to a place like that. Her mother was alone and needed the diabetes medication she was going to buy with that $2,000. But Adrian didn't listen to her objections, just instructed Marco to take care of all the medical costs and ensure she received the best possible care. While Chloe was being treated and stitched up by an on-call medical team, Adrian remained in the hospital corridor, smoking one cigarette after another, trying to understand what had happened to him that night. At 40, he commanded an empire that stretched from international trafficking to money laundering through underground casinos and front companies. He hadn't gotten there by being sentimental or allowing strangers to influence his decisions. But there was something in that young woman's desperate courage that bothered him, in a way he couldn't name. Maybe it was the distant memory of his own mother, Eleanor Vance, who died when he was 16 because they didn't have money for her cancer treatment. Or maybe it was the recognition of a purity he had lost so long ago he couldn't even remember what it felt like. 2 hours later, when Chloe came out of the consultation room with a bandaged forehead and medical instructions in her hands, Adrian was waiting for her, leaning against the wall, still smoking. She stopped in front of him, clearly confused about his intentions. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice firmer now that the pain had subsided with the painkillers. "I didn't ask for your charity." "It wasn't charity," Adrian replied, dropping the cigarette on the floor and stamping it out. "It was an investment." "An investment in what?" Adrian studied her for a moment, noticing how she maintained her straight posture despite her exhaustion, how her eyes didn't shy away from his, even though she knew who he was. This girl had character, more than any of the empty women who frequented his bed. "I don't know yet," he admitted with an honesty that surprised him, "but I'm going to find out." In the following days, Adrian found himself doing something he had never done before, investigating someone out of genuine curiosity rather than strategic necessity. He discovered that Chloe Evans had grown up in one of New York's most violent neighborhoods, the daughter of Sarah Evans, a cleaner who worked 3 different jobs to support her daughter and afford her own diabetes treatment. At 17, Chloe had earned a full scholarship to study business at NYU, becoming the first person in her family to set foot in a university. She had worked since she was 15 to help with household expenses, always in jobs that forced her to smile at people who treated her like furniture. She had sold ice cream on the beach, cleaned houses on weekends, and served coffee in downtown offices. When she got the job at the Madison Avenue boutique, she thought she was finally moving up in the world. It was there she met Ethan Cole, a mistake that almost cost her her sanity. What impressed Adrian the most was discovering that despite all the hardships, Chloe had never gotten involved with drugs, prostitution, or any of the easy paths the streets offered to young women desperate for money. She remained honest, studying late into the night under the dim light of a fluorescent lamp, dreaming of a better future for herself and her mother. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole continued his campaign of psychological terror. He showed up at the boutique where Chloe worked, feigning interest in buying something for his new girlfriend just to see her despair. He sent flowers to her house with cards containing threats disguised as declarations of love. He hired private investigators to watch her every move and then called to describe where she had been, who she had spoken to, what clothes she had worn. The last straw came a week after their hospital encounter. Ethan showed up at Chloe's university during a financial management class, claiming to be a guest speaker. He got permission to talk to the students about youth entrepreneurship and spent 20 minutes staring directly at her while describing in details that made her blood run cold how certain naive people could be molded to become ideal partners in business and in life. Chloe left the class shaking and went straight to the bathroom to throw up. It was there she found a card strategically left on the sink. "You have 24 hours to come home. Your mother is not feeling well and needs expensive medication. E." Desperate, Chloe called home and discovered that Sarah Evans had indeed fallen ill that morning. Her blood sugar had spiked for no apparent reason, and she had to be rushed to a public health clinic. A coincidence? Chloe doubted it. Ethan had enough connections to interfere even with her mother's medication. It was then that she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of giving in to the blackmail or trying to solve it alone, Chloe decided to seek out the only man in New York who had shown, even if briefly, some genuine concern for her well-being. Finding Adrian wasn't difficult. Men like him had predictable routines when it came to business. Every Tuesday at 8 in the evening, he dined at the Oak Room at the Plaza, always at the corner table that offered a full view of the restaurant and 2 emergency exits. Chloe arrived at the restaurant wearing the only formal dress she owned, a simple black piece she had bought second-hand for job interviews. The maitre d' tried to stop her from entering, claiming she didn't have a reservation, but Chloe simply said she was there to meet Adrian Vance. The name worked like a magic password. 5 minutes later, she was being escorted to his table. Adrian looked up from his plate of shrimp risotto and saw her walking toward him. Even with her forehead still bandaged, even with the visible tension in her shoulders, she was the most beautiful woman who had ever set foot in that restaurant, and also the most out of place. "Are you okay?" was the first thing he asked when she sat down across from him. "No," Chloe answered with brutal honesty, "and I need your real help this time." Adrian gestured to the waiter, who immediately brought water and bread for Chloe, and waited for her to speak. She told him about Ethan's appearance at the university, about her mother's condition, about the 24-hour deadline he had given her. Her voice remained steady throughout the story, but Adrian could see her hands trembling slightly as she held the water glass. "He's not going to stop," she concluded, "and I can't do this alone anymore." Adrian finished chewing a piece of shrimp before replying, using the time to process not only the information, but also the strange sense of protectiveness that had taken hold of him. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want him gone from my life, not necessarily dead," she added quickly, "but for him to stop stalking me, to leave my mother in peace, so I can breathe again without looking over my shoulder." Adrian studied her in silence for a long moment. There was something about her that challenged everything he knew about survival, about power, about the unwritten rules that governed his world. She was here, vulnerable and terrified, asking for help from the most dangerous man she knew, but doing so with a dignity he rarely saw even among his most seasoned associates. "This will have a price," he said finally. "I know, and I'm willing to pay anything." "Anything is a dangerous promise to make to someone like me." Chloe looked him directly in the eyes, and Adrian saw a determination there that rivaled his own. "Then tell me the price, and I'll decide if I can pay it." Adrian smiled for the first time since she had sat down. It wasn't a kind smile. Men like him had forgotten how to do that. It was a smile that recognized a worthy adversary, even if she didn't know she was fighting a war. "The price," he said, "is total trust. You do exactly what I say when I say it without questions. And in return, I guarantee that Ethan Cole will never be a problem for you or your mother again." Chloe didn't hesitate for a second before extending her hand to seal the deal. "I accept." When their hands touched over the restaurant table, they both felt an electricity that had nothing to do with business or protection. It was the beginning of something neither of them was prepared to face, but which would become inevitable from that moment on. The change in Chloe's life was radical and immediate. Adrian arranged for a secure apartment in a modern building on the Upper West Side, a functional space with a military-grade monitoring system and 2 discreet bodyguards on permanent patrol in the building. Sarah Evans was transferred to a premium health plan and began receiving specialized medical care for her diabetes, as well as physical therapy and nutritional counseling she had never dreamed of having access to. To the outside world, Chloe had received an international scholarship that included housing and medical assistance for her family. The story was plausible enough not to raise suspicions at the university or at work, where she continued to go as usual, always discreetly escorted by trained men who posed as students or ordinary passers-by. Ethan Cole quickly discovered that something had changed. His attempts to approach her were blocked before he could even get close to Chloe. The private investigators he hired to watch her began to refuse the job, citing scheduling conflicts that he knew were lies. His calls to her cell phone were automatically blocked, and when he tried to show up at the university again, he was politely but firmly escorted off campus by security guards who clearly did not belong to the institution. What Ethan didn't know was that Adrian had taken much deeper measures to neutralize him. Through his extensive network of contacts, he discovered that the businessman had tax evasion schemes that could result in years in prison if they reached the right authorities. In addition, some of his real estate ventures involved money laundering for corrupt politicians, information that Adrian kept as life insurance. But it was during a private meeting in one of Adrian's underground poker rooms that Ethan received the clearest message. Sitting in a private room, surrounded by men whose reputation for violence was known throughout New York, he listened with growing pallor as Adrian described in clinical detail exactly what would happen if he continued to stalk Chloe Evans. "You have 2 options," Adrian said, lighting a Cuban cigar as he spoke. "The first is to disappear completely from her life. Move to another city, another state, another country if necessary. The second is to find out how hard it is to conduct business from a permanent hospital bed." Ethan tried to maintain his composure, claiming he had political connections and resources to protect himself. Adrian just smiled and slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of Ethan with corrupt politicians, proof of illegal transactions, and recordings of compromising conversations. It was enough material to destroy not only his freedom, but his entire network of protection. "Your connections," Adrian said calmly, "are exactly what will destroy you if you don't disappear from my sight in the next 48 hours. The threat worked. Ethan Cole sold his New York businesses with suspicious speed and moved to Los Angeles, where he would try to rebuild his life far from the reach of Adrian Vance. For Chloe, it was as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she was able to sleep through the night without nightmares, but freedom brought with it a complication she hadn't anticipated: her growing intimacy with Adrian. What began as sporadic meetings to discuss security issues evolved into long, deep conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. He would show up at the apartment unannounced, always with some excuse related to protection procedures. But Chloe began to realize that the real reasons were much more personal. Adrian revealed himself to be a deeply complex man, whose cold exterior hid a sharp intellect and a loneliness he carried like an unhealed wound. During their conversations, he talked about the books he read voraciously during sleepless nights, the classical music he listened to while planning operations, the memories of his childhood in Spain with the grandfather who taught him that honor was more important than life. Chloe discovered that behind the feared criminal, there was a man who sent anonymous money to orphanages, who never allowed his operations to involve children, who had ordered an associate killed for raping a teenager. There was a twisted but genuine moral code that governed his actions, a line he would never cross, even if it meant losing millions. The attraction between them grew with each meeting, an electric tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Adrian had never felt a genuine emotional need for a woman, always managing to separate sex from intimacy with a surgeon's precision. But Chloe challenged all his self-control mechanisms. She listened to his stories without judgment, disagreed with his opinions with a courage that fascinated him, and looked at him as if she saw something beyond the monster he believed he had become. For Chloe, Adrian represented everything she had been taught to fear and avoid, but he was also the man who had saved her life without asking for anything in return. There was a hesitant kindness in the way he spoke to her, a vulnerability he showed only when they were alone. It was as if in her presence he could remember who he had been before he became who he was. The turning point happened on a rainy September night. Adrian arrived at the apartment later than usual, visibly disturbed. An operation had gone wrong, resulting in the deaths of 3 of his men in a confrontation with a rival faction. Chloe found him on the balcony, looking out at the city through the raindrops streaking down the glass. "They had families," he said without turning around. "Little kids, wives who will now have to fend for themselves." "You'll take care of them," Chloe stated, knowing instinctively that he had already made arrangements. "That doesn't bring them back." Chloe moved closer, standing beside him on the balcony. For the first time since they had met, she saw tears in Adrian's eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a helpless rage against a world that forced men to die for money and territory. "You're not the monster you think you are," she said softly. "You don't know what I'm capable of. I know you saved me when you had no reason to. I know you take care of my mother as if she were your own family. I know you're here, torturing yourself over the deaths of men who chose to follow you, knowing the risks." Adrian faced her, and Chloe saw in the depths of his dark eyes a desperate need for absolution, for someone who could look at him and see something beyond the crimes he had committed. Without thinking about what she was doing, she moved closer and gently touched his face. The kiss that followed was inevitable, charged with months of repressed tension and an emotional intimacy that both had been trying to deny. Adrian kissed her like a thirsty man drinking water, with a hunger that went far beyond the physical. It was the need for connection, to be completely accepted by someone who knew his darkest flaws. When they broke apart, they both knew they had crossed a line that would change everything between them. There was no more pretending that what they felt was just gratitude or protection. It was love, intense and impossible, between 2 people whose worlds should never have met. "This is crazy," Chloe whispered, her hands still on his face. "It is," Adrian agreed, "but it's the first sane thing I've felt in 20 years. They made love that night, with an intensity that surprised them both. It wasn't just physical desire, but a complete emotional surrender that left them both vulnerable, in a way they had never experienced. Adrian touched Chloe as if she were made of precious crystal, while she kissed him as if her lips could heal all the wounds he carried in his soul. But the next morning, reality came knocking in the form of Marco, Adrian's head of security, with news that would change everything. The FBI had launched a large-scale operation against criminal organizations in New York, and Adrian's name was at the top of the priority target list. Worse, Someone very close was providing detailed information about his operations. There was a traitor in his organization, and the life he had begun to build with Chloe was about to crumble in the most violent way possible. The discovery of the betrayal came from an unexpected source. Victor Rossi, one of Adrian's oldest lieutenants, had been arrested 3 days earlier during a routine port operation. Marco found out he wasn't in any official precinct, but in an FBI safe house, where he had agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for protection for his family. What made the situation even more serious was that Victor knew all the details of Adrian's financial operations, including the offshore accounts and money laundering schemes. But what really made Adrian's blood run cold was discovering that the plea deal had been orchestrated by Ethan Cole, who had offered information about criminal activities in New York in exchange for immunity for his own fiscal crimes. Ethan had spent the last 2 months in Los Angeles not just hiding, but building an alliance with corrupt federal agents who saw Adrian's downfall as an opportunity to take control of part of his business. His revenge was meticulous and cruel. If he couldn't have Chloe, he would completely destroy the man she loved. Adrian knew he had only a few hours before the FBI surrounded all his known hideouts. The options were limited and all dangerous. He could try to flee the country using the fake identities he kept for emergencies, but that would mean abandoning Chloe forever. He could stay and fight, but that would put her directly in the line of fire of a war that wasn't hers. The most painful decision of his life was made in the living room of the apartment on the Upper West Side, while Chloe slept in the next room, unaware of the storm that was approaching. Adrian wrote a letter explaining everything: the betrayal, the imminent police operation, and why he had to send her away. He had contacts in London who could secure a new identity for her, enough resources for her to live comfortably and continue her studies. When Chloe woke up and found the letter, along with fake passports and a plane ticket to London, departing in 6 hours, she felt as if the world had caved in on her. It wasn't just the separation that devastated her, but the way Adrian had made the decision alone, without giving her the right to choose to face the risks by his side. She found him at the Central Park penthouse, where he was burning documents and preparing to disappear. The argument that followed was the most intense they had ever had, with Chloe accusing him of emotional cowardice and him insisting he was protecting her the only way he knew how. "You can't love me and then decide what's best for me without asking me," she yelled, tears of anger streaming down her face. "I'm not a child who needs to be protected from her own decisions. You don't understand," Adrian replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "If you stay here, they'll use you against me. They'll hurt you to force me to surrender. I can't live knowing you're suffering because of me. And I can't live knowing you're facing this alone." The conversation was interrupted by Marco's arrival with urgent news. The police operation had been moved up. They had 2 hours at most before the penthouse was surrounded. Worse, they had intercepted communications indicating that Ethan was personally involved in the operation, likely hoping to be present when Adrian was arrested. It was then that Chloe made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of accepting the protection Adrian offered, she proposed an alternative that none of them had considered, using Ethan's obsession with her as bait to lure him into a trap. "He wants me back," she said with a cold determination that reminded Adrian of himself. "Let's give him exactly what he wants." The plan they devised over the next 2 hours was extremely risky. Chloe would call Ethan, pretending to have discovered the police operation through Adrian, and offer information about his hideouts in exchange for protection for herself and her mother. Ethan, blinded by the possibility of getting her back and being responsible for his rival's capture, would agree to meet her at an isolated location before the official operation. Adrian initially refused to let her risk herself like that, but Chloe was adamant. It was their only chance to neutralize Ethan for good and get evidence of his collaboration with corrupt agents, information that could be used to negotiate Adrian's freedom. The meeting was set for an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx, a location that offered multiple escape routes and where Adrian could strategically position his men. Chloe wore a hidden microphone to record the conversation, while trained snipers kept her in their sights to ensure her protection. Ethan arrived at the location, accompanied by two federal agents who were clearly being paid to participate in the off-the-books operation. His arrogance was palpable when he saw Chloe waiting alone in the center of the warehouse, believing he had finally regained control over her. "I knew you'd come back," he said, the cruel smile she knew so well twisting his features. "Women like you always choose security over love." "You're right," Chloe replied, forcing submission into her voice. "I want to come back to you. I want everything to be like it was before." Over the next 15 minutes, Ethan confessed his plans in detail, including the corruption of the federal agents and his intention to take over part of Adrian's business after his arrest. More importantly, he revealed that he had forged evidence to frame Chloe as an accomplice in the criminal activities, ensuring she would be arrested along with Adrian if she tried to run. It was then that Adrian emerged from the shadows, accompanied by Marco and other armed men, that Ethan realized he had fallen into a trap. The expression on his face changed from triumph to pure terror as he understood he had confessed all his crimes on tape. "You were always too stupid to be truly dangerous," Adrian said calmly as his men disarmed the corrupt agents. "But you managed to annoy me enough to deserve a special lesson." What happened in the following hours changed everything. The recordings of Ethan confessing his partnership with corrupt federal agents were handed over to the FBI's internal affairs, resulting in an investigation that exposed the entire network of corruption. The honest agents involved in the original operation discovered they had been manipulated, and that much of the evidence against Adrian had been fabricated or exaggerated by Ethan. Ethan Cole disappeared that night. Officially, he fled the country to avoid being arrested for corruption and racketeering. Unofficially, only Adrian and his closest men knew he never left that warehouse alive. It was a brutal but definitive justice. In the months that followed, Adrian began a careful process of legitimizing his businesses. Using expert lawyers and leveraging the exposure of police corruption, he managed to negotiate deals that cleared him of the most serious charges in exchange for information on other criminals and financial compensation to the victims of his past activities. It was not an easy or quick process. It required him to completely abandon the criminal world, surrendering territories and burning bridges he had spent decades building. But for the first time in his adult life, Adrian had a reason to want out of that life, to build a future where he could love Chloe without putting her in danger. Chloe, for her part, discovered an inner strength she never knew she had during the crisis. Facing Ethan and actively participating in resolving the conflict transformed her from a victim into a survivor, from a protected person into a partner. She graduated from college with honors and began working at an NGO that helped other women who were victims of domestic violence, using her own experience to offer hope and practical guidance. 2 years after their meeting in that dark Hell's Kitchen alley, Adrian and Chloe married in a simple ceremony on the beach in Carmel by the Sea, with only Sarah Evans and a few close friends present. He had become a legitimate businessman, investing in tech companies and social projects. She ran a foundation that provided scholarships for young people from underprivileged backgrounds, especially women who had suffered domestic violence. Their scars, both physical and emotional, remained, but they became symbols of overcoming rather than shame. Adrian still woke up some nights with nightmares about his past, but he found peace in Chloe's arms. She still felt anxiety in crowds, but she knew he would always be there to protect her. The love that had been born in darkness blossomed in the light, proving that even the most lost souls can find redemption when they find someone willing to fight by their side. Together, they built not just a relationship, but a new life based on truth, mutual respect, and the conviction that the past does not have to define the future. Sarah Evans, finally in stable health and proud of the daughter who had become a transformative force in her own circumstances, always said that it was Chloe's courage in asking for help that saved not only her, but also a man who seemed lost forever. It was an unlikely love story, born from violence and tempered by struggle, but it proved that redemption is possible when one has the courage to change and someone who believes in that change. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you so much.